Welcome to the Little Sparks Podcast, your home for all things faith and music. I'm Cecilia.
And I'm Tara.
And we're former college roommates, professional musicians, and co-founders of the Hildegard Collective, a space for Catholic musicians to connect with one another and grow in their faith and profession. This podcast is an outreach of the collective, so if you're interested at all in Catholicism, music, or both, this is the podcast for you. Join us each week as we get real, share stories, and learn from other awesome Catholic musicians. We're all little sparks of God's divine creation, so together, let's ignite the world for Christ.
Welcome back, everybody, to the Little Sparks podcast. Today, we are bringing you an episode on a very, very important topic that is going to lay the foundation for a lot of things that we are going to be addressing going forward to do with the music industry, to do with our own personal practice and understanding of our instruments. And believe it or not, that is theology of the body. Some of you may have heard of it before. It's a very, very, very important piece of work from Pope St. John Paul II. And we are going to dive into its history, its importance, and then some practical tips and steps about how to incorporate these very critical teachings into your own life as a musician.
Yeah, I'm so excited that we're chatting about this topic. I love theology of the body, and I think sometimes it's a misunderstood teaching by a lot of Catholics, and there's just a depth of beauty to it that is just absolutely incredible, and it's applicable to every single one of us, no matter what our state in life is, which is just incredible.
Yeah.
So to kind of just dive right into it, what exactly is theology of the body, right? So remember, going back to our very first episode, theology means study of God. So the theology of the body is essentially the theology that the human body reveals to us what God made us for. And that's pretty much the most simplistic definition of theology of the body that you can get. Why can we think this? We go right to Genesis 1, and we see in verse 27, so God created humankind in his image. In the image of God, he created them. Male and female, he created them. So right here is kind of that foundational scripture verse for theology of the body. So this is a major work from Pope St. John Paul II. He began it before he was Pope, back when he was Karol Wojtyła. He wrote a extensively long book called Love and Responsibility, which is all about theology of the body and human sexuality. My husband actually read it while we were dating. I have not opened it, to be honest, because it is an extremely dense read.
Yeah, it's huge.
And there are some wonderful writers out there who have been able to take that book and break it down into more layman's terms. While he was Pope, he created a series within the traditional papal Wednesday audiences that he would hold. And over the course of 5 years, he used these Wednesday audiences to discuss this concept of the theology of the body. And he just really broke it down over the course of it. It literally took him 5 years to get through all of what he wanted to communicate on this. So the vast bulk of theology of the body has to do with human sexuality. And at the time that he was giving these talks, it was absolutely revolutionary for a couple of reasons. One of it was this was taking place post-sexual revolution.
Mm-hmm.
So it was the church speaking into what was going on in the sexual revolution. And then the second reason is it was shocking, often in a good way, for many people to hear that the church actually had positive things to say about human sexuality. Because at this point in time, there was this idea, generally pervasive idea, that the church was very negative about human sexuality and frowned upon it, and all of this stuff. And so a lot of people would, hear this and be shocked that the church actually had good things to say about human sexuality.
Yeah.
And for many, many people who heard initially the message of theology of the body, it really broke open their worlds and perspectives in a new wonderful, beautiful way. That because the thing with theology of the body is that it actually, if you really go through it with an open heart, it can totally change your perspective on humans and creation in general. And it's just beautiful, you know? I will say right here that something that is important to note before we go any further, that our lived experiences can tend to come up short against the beauty of the theology of the body. And so it can sometimes feel like there's friction there. And I just want to speak into that, you know, that it's totally normal if your lived experiences are coming up short against theology of the body and it feels like there's friction. Like that's normal to feel that friction because we live in a broken world. And so theology shows us how things ought to be. And the brokenness of sin will always come up short against that, you know? So there's always healing to be done. And there are, you know, the wounds of sin are very, very real. So that's just something, you know, to keep in mind, you know, as we go forward with talking about theology of the body.
Yeah. It's really important to say nobody has ever lived theology of the body completely perfectly except those who were sinless, you know? And
AKA Mary, the Blessed Mother.
And Jesus.
And Jesus too. Yes.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, obviously.
And I think it's important to note that like human sexuality is a hugely important part of our human experience. Because, you know, as you will see as we get more into this, you know, it reveals so much to us about ourselves and about God and what we were created for and the sort of love and like ultimate divine purpose that each of us has in life. And so human sexuality in its many forms, good and bad, can feel hugely, hugely important. And it is. We can't hold ourselves to an expectation that any of us will live this out perfectly, even if we understand it. Because this sort of temptation is very real and it weighs very heavily on many of us. And the quest to live out theology of the body perfectly is a lifelong quest that ultimately we will find the fulfillment of that in heaven. So just as we talk about this, just be, even if you're learning things for the first time and things are clicking for you and you're seeming to be able to make sense of things, just be careful not to hold yourself to unrealistic and unreasonable expectations for your state in life right now, because this is a lifelong journey for all of us, learning how to live this out, what this looks like in our day-to-day life, what this really means for us as individuals and our own relationships with people. So just give yourself grace and pray for grace as well, to be able to live this out in its fullness.
Amen to that. So there are kind of like a few main points in theology of the body that I want to bring up, that John Paul II kind of lays out. So the first one, and this it all goes, he goes into Genesis, like the first couple chapters of Genesis, and just really dives into what Genesis is saying and what this means. So the first really important point is that we as humans are made to be gifts to each other. And so the main way in which John Paul II lays this out is through marriage, through a husband and a wife giving themselves entirely to each other. With that being said, you know, we can take this and see as well that there, you know, we're not just made to give ourselves to a spouse, especially because not all of us get married. But no matter what, we're made to be gifts, you know, like we are gifts to each other. And it can seem almost like a paradox in many ways, that in giving ourselves away, we will find fulfillment, but it is how it works. And the more that we each are all striving to do this, the more beautifully we'll be able to see love in action and what we were designed to do in the first place, that original sin, kind of ate away at. So that's the first thing, is that, we're made to be gifts to each other.
Mm-hmm.
The next thing is that in Genesis, we see God saying about Adam that it's not good for man to be alone. Like Adam, when God says this, is without Eve at this point. He has nobody to give himself to.
Mm-hmm.
And so when Eve is created, then Adam is like, oh my gosh, like this is who I'm meant to give myself to,
Yeah.
He finds fulfillment in that. He's able to be a gift to Eve.
Mm-hmm.
So John Paul II gives like technical terms to this. He calls it original solitude and original unity. So like Adam's solitude, like that's this original solitude, and then or this original unity of when Eve is created. So, obviously Adam and Eve are able to give themselves entirely to each other in a marital relationship. And that is, that again, that's like at the human sexuality is at the forefront of theology of the body. But we can then again, going back to that, we're meant to be gifts. We can see that, and also tying it in with what St. Paul says in, I think it's one of his letters to the Corinthians, about how we're all meant to be unified in the mystical body of Christ.
Yeah.
We can find, meaning there as well for this.
Yeah. And we're also made in the image and likeness of a triune God. God in his nature is literally social. And if we are made in the image of that nature, then we also are inherently made to be social and to be around other people, loving other people, giving ourselves to other people.
Exactly. So I actually have thoughts on this pertaining to musicians, so remind me to bring them up later when we're talking about that. One of the other points is that there was this original nakedness, and basically Adam and Eve felt no shame seeing each other naked. Like there was no reason for there to be shame. And that connects with the final point, that main point that John Paul II makes, which is original shame. And after the sin of Adam and Eve, we see in Genesis that they look at each other and they both realize they're naked, and they cover themselves up.
Mm-hmm.
They now have original sin on their souls, and they don't see each other in the light that they were created to see each other in.
Yeah.
And we have seen this play itself out over and over and over and over again in human history, where, and it might be part of your own history if you're listening to this, it might be part of your own history that you have been looked at in a way that you were not meant to be looked at. And that can cause a lot of hurt and wounds,
Mm-hmm.
So, anyway, so those are kind of like the 5 big points of theology of the body. Although another one that I should bring up as well is that, going back to that Genesis 1:27, where, God makes man in his image and likeness. It also emphasizes that God created them male and female. And so there are specific gifts that men have that they are designed to give to the world, and there are specific gifts that females have that they're designed to give to the world. But not even just that, but they're unique ways of being able to give themselves to each other, or to their families, their friends. And we can see this through, John Paul II says, like our human sexuality shows us what these features are, you know.
Yeah.
I think it's either in Letter to Women or his encyclical on the dignity of women. John Paul II brings up the idea of the feminine genius, for instance. And there are four key points that he makes that are like distinct features on what this feminine genius looks like. So maternity is one of them. And it's because as women, we're created with the capability to carry life within us. Whether or not we ever do is another matter altogether.
Yeah.
But that points to maternity. Maternity is not necessarily just physical. There's also a spiritual element to maternity, which is just as, if not more important, you know, like even a biological mother has to have an element of spiritual maternity in her relationship with her children. Otherwise, you end up with really broken mother-child relationships if it's seen as just purely a physical thing. Like, yes, I'm your biological mother, you know, and naturally, for most people, like this is, you know, going to be that spiritual side will come naturally with like a biological maternal relationship.
Yeah.
But what does that mean for single women? You have a gift of spiritual maternity that you can give to others. What does it mean if you are dealing with infertility? You have the gift of spiritual motherhood that you can give to others.
Yeah.
Or consecrated women who are, you know, spouses of Jesus Christ. They are never going to have biological children, but they still have this spiritual maternity. So like maternity is one of those things. Generosity is another one. And that points to, you know, how the body, like, you know, the body basically makes, you know, space for another human. It's generous. It's giving. So sensitivity is another one. As, you know, we can see how mothers are are able to respond to their children's needs in very specific ways. And so, you know, the feminine heart has a gift in being able to see others' needs and desires and, you know, be able to
respond.
And be able to make space for those. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And then the last one is receptivity, which we can see in, you know, a woman's body receives the man, receives the sperm, and then, you know, the sperm and the egg, if they meet, you know, make a child. So there's that receptivity that we can see there. There's also this spiritual receptivity that women have as well. And it's important to note, because I used to think this, so I want to bring it up. It's important to note the receptivity does not mean being passive. Like we see, the Blessed Mother gives us a really good example at the Annunciation and what she does right after. And we see her receive the message of the angel and receive the incarnation of Christ in her body. And she doesn't just sit there and be like, okay, I'm going to, you know, just be here for the next 9 months growing the, you know, Messiah in my womb. The angel tells her that her cousin Elizabeth is pregnant in her old age. So Mary drops everything and goes. So receptivity is not being passive.
Yeah.
And that's very important to note. It's receiving, you know, it's receiving the Lord, it's receiving the gifts of others, and then responding to them in active ways. Unfortunately, John Paul II didn't write out a lovely treatise on the masculine genius. And it is, I wish that he had, because I think it would be, you know, so awesome to have something written out the way he did for women.
Yeah.
But he saw at the time, you know, the societal and cultural shifts that were happening and wanted to respond to women because at the time. And that's why he wrote things like his Letter to Women and his encyclical on the dignity of women. And that's where we get this feminine genius from, which is really just this, like, you know, this extension of theology of the body for women.
Exactly.
But there are key elements for men as well.
Yeah. And just quickly before we touch on men, one more thing I want to say to the women is,
Yes.
and I think this is probably part of the reason that JP2 was so attentive to the needs of women, is because there has been a shift in our society of taking these beautiful feminine traits and trying to make them into insults and say
Mm.
you are too sensitive, or you're too generous, you give too much of yourself, or you're too receptive and you don't offer enough of you don't bring enough to the table. And I just would encourage you to actively combat that in your life and also in your own mentality. Like, because there are
Mm-hmm.
some women who I know, and I think, to be honest, probably at a certain point in my life, I would have reacted very negatively to being called sensitive, for example.
Oh, same here.
And it's been a huge shift in perspective to come to see and understand that as a gift. And it's unfortunate that we can't make everybody see it that way, because there are certainly times in certain conversations and interactions with people that I would love to be able to push back and say, but no, like, what you're accusing me of is not a bad thing. And so I would just encourage you to be aware of that in your interactions with people, and be aware of your own perceptions and understandings of these beautiful feminine gifts. They also don't have to look like they do in anybody else's life, because we're
Absolutely.
all individuals at the end of the day, and we have our own perspectives, our own experiences that inform who we are as people, how we respond to different stimulus in our lives, and ultimately the decisions that we make in terms of our behavior, in terms of our attitudes, in terms of our interactions with other people. And so all of these qualities will look different to a greater or lesser degree for every single woman. So don't let anybody tell you that you're not living out your femininity in the right way. That's nonsense.
Yes, absolutely. And on that note, I also want to add that sometimes some of these characteristics of the feminine genius can be difficult for some of us to live out in our lives because of wounds or hurts that are associated with that particular trait, you know?
Mm,
Like, for instance, if you've been called too sensitive throughout your life, you're probably going to struggle with embracing sensitivity as a gift, because
mhm,
sensitivity is actually a gift. Um, being able to respond to others in a sensitive and gentle way, and just being sensitive of the needs of others, sensitive of, tones in conversations, or, cues that people give out, or whatnot, you know what I mean? Like, there's a wide
mhm,
array of what being sensitive looks like. um that's actually a gift that we can give to other people, and that's beautiful.
mhm,
um so, but if you've been made fun of for being quote unquote too sensitive, that's going to be harder, most likely,
yeah,
to see it as a gift. So if some of these are like, you're hearing them and it just kind of rubs you the wrong way, or you're like, but how is this a gift? I encourage you to take this to prayer and, see what the Lord wants to reveal to you in those places. And see if there's any healing that needs to happen as well.
yeah,
So, or even just reframing of perspective, because maybe it's all a perspective thing too, like you were saying, Tara.
yeah, totally.
So it's going to look different for each woman, and that's beautiful. So yeah, so there are some people out there who have tried to, expound on the idea of a masculine genius. I know providing and protecting are two, because we see Adam's job in the garden, where he is supposed to be, well, actually, we see it really in his lack of being by Eve. We can see that he's supposed to be protective, a protector, and he's not there when Eve is approached by the serpent. Like, what is he doing? He's not doing his job at all. That's why it's called the sin of Adam, not the sin of Eve. Because like in the first place, he was not doing what he was supposed to be doing. So, a lot of people can like bristle at the idea of like a man being a protector and a provider. And I think that's because a lot of times, in human history, men have, and this comes out of original sin, and we see this in what God says to Adam and Eve after original sin, that men are going to have a tendency to want to dominate women, and we've seen that play out time and time and time and time again in human history. And we've seen there have been men who have used this idea of providing and protecting to an aggressive manner and turn it into something that it's not. Turn it into something that's like power wielding instead of serving. Remember, men are supposed to be gifts to their wives just as much as, wives are to be gifts to their husbands. Yes. And on the note of like, the idea of providing and protecting, I had a really good conversation with a friend of mine a while ago about this. And it was with her then fiance. She said that, I don't remember if it was he, I think he might have said this, that the role of providing and protecting doesn't just apply to providing and protecting in a physical manner. It also has to do with emotional stuff as well, and spiritual stuff. So like the idea of like, for instance, like in a marriage, like a husband creating a safe space in his heart to receive his wife and what she's going through, and to hear her, and just to be a safe place for her,
Yeah.
But it's not just like husbands that have this, job to provide and protect emotionally, so to speak. That can look like, men looking out for those who are quote unquote weaker, whether it's like socially weaker or physically weaker or whatnot.
Yeah.
Looking out for the little guy, standing up for what's right. There are a lot of different ways in which this can look, instead of the typical of thought of like, oh, like a husband, going out and working while his husband or his wife is a stay-at-home mom,
Yeah.
Like there's a lot of different ways this can look. So that's just some things we're thinking there for men.
And something I want to touch on quickly is that spiritual fatherhood is also just as real as spiritual motherhood. And
yes.
Just as
I completely
crucial.
forgot to bring that up, so thank you for bringing that up.
And like just as crucial and just as important. And like we see it, I think, probably the most clearly in the example of priests.
Yes.
And there are some priests who I think just are exceptional at exemplifying this spiritual fatherhood in the way that they lay down their lives and their comfort every single day for their parish and their community and the flock that they are called to shepherd. And that same sort of spiritual fatherhood, by extension, applies to all men, whether or not you're a priest. You could be a husband and father. You could be a single man. You could be a young guy still trying to figure out what his vocation is. But at every stage of your life, you're called to embrace these positive qualities of masculinity and exemplify this spiritual fatherhood to the people around you, in trying to be a protector and a provider and a leader and all of these wonderful things that men are called to be in their lives.
Amen to that. So thank you for bringing that up, because I knew there was like one thing that I was missing, and it's paternity. It's paternity, protection, and providing is like the three main things that I've heard from those theologians who have been trying to flesh out what a masculine genius looks like.
Yeah.
So that's the basics of theology of the body. There's a lot more to get into with it, and it's there's a lot of beauty to it. So thank you, Pope St. John Paul II.
Yes, absolutely. What a gift he's given us in this greater understanding of human sexuality. It's so good.
It is.
So now the question becomes, how do we live out theology of the body and our human sexuality as musicians? What does that look like?
Yeah. And I think there are many different ways that we could take this. One thing I want to note, and I think I've shared this before because we did a like kind of an elementary sort of like intro to theology of the body in our first season. And I think I think I've shared this before, but when I was going through my injuries back in college and I was taking Alexander technique lessons to help cope with my tendonitis, my instructor said something that so profoundly struck me. And she said that the human body was designed to move freely. And in that moment, all I could think of was, that's a theology of the body right there. Because at the end of the day, theology of the body, even though what John Paul II has given us, like, really largely has to do with human sexuality, theology of the body is basically, going back to that original definition that I gave was, it's the theology that the human body reveals to us what God made us for.
Yeah.
So if the human body is designed to move freely, that means that's telling us that God designed us for freedom. And we see that with our free will. We see that in the way that he's, made us to be able to choose him, or we can choose sin. We can choose against him. But we have that free will. So but it's so fascinating that that's even built. That's not just, a spiritual thing. It's built into our bodies, this freedom that God made us for.
Yeah.
So
and
it's crazy that something as simple as Alexander's technique can show us a little bit more of another side of theology of the body.
And I think, especially if your first teacher or maybe first couple teachers maybe weren't as cognizant of relieving tension in your playing or your singing from, your earliest days of music lessons, it can be a really hard and frustrating process to try and break down that tension later in your studies or your career, because, like, what's the phrase they say, like, old habits die hard or something. And like, this is the exact example of that phrase, because over our lives we build up these really negative habits of tension in our bodies when we carry stress, whether that's emotional stress or physical stress from putting different strains on different muscles and tendons and ligaments in our bodies, and also from creating like these negative tensions when we play or when we sing. And I think of it kind of like stretching in a way, because like everybody knows what it feels like to have like a really good stretch. Like maybe you've just come back from a run and you're like stretching out your calves and it like hurts so good, to use that phrase.
Yeah.
Everybody knows what it feels like to have a stretch that just hits exactly the right muscles and it kind of relieves some of that tension and that stress. But at the same time, it's also like that's completely different to like stretching a muscle the wrong way and pulling that muscle. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So I kind of think of the tensions in the body, like whether you're a singer or an instrumentalist, as kind of like comparing stretching with like pulling a muscle, basically. And so many of us develop habits early in our music careers that lead to a lot of pulled muscles and like bad and negative tension. And it can be really hard to train yourself to feel the difference between this negative, damaging, bad tension in your body and like good tension that allows you to actually use your instrument correctly and create beautiful music. And so if you're in a place in your career or your studies where you are really struggling with breaking some of these old habits of tension, I feel ya. And I'm just want to really encourage you, like, not to give up on that, because it is an incredibly trying, difficult process. You know, you have to learn to feel a lot of the really small muscles in your body that you would not have any other reason to really be aware of. And it can be really frustrating and it can feel crazy sometimes, but it really is very well worth it in the end, because ultimately allowing yourself to produce music in the freedom that our bodies were created for is going to give you longevity in your instrument. And it's ultimately going to be a much easier and more pleasant experience for you to make music.
Oh yeah, absolutely. It's almost like with like, you know, these like injuries and sources of tension and all of that. A comparison can almost be made to the spiritual life, of where, you know, like if when you're starting out on the spiritual life, you're kind of at first focusing on clearing out the big vices that you might have, but then as you know, progress, you're going to be aware of smaller things as well. Like, not that, like, you know, they're like quote unquote smaller sins, I guess, you know, you could almost think of as like, you know, say like, you know, a habit of being impatient versus, you know, maybe a habit of um getting really angry and acting out on that anger a lot. You know what I mean?
Totally.
Um Still sin, but you know what I mean.
Yeah.
But it's like almost like like seeing those, like being aware of those smaller muscles and what they're doing, you know. Um there's almost like, yeah, I feel like there's just like kind of a little bit of a comparison to the spiritual life there, which is fun.
Yeah. And like I also harken back to the part of the Gospels where we talk about how God counts every single hair on our head. And it is a constant reminder for me that there is no inch of our bodies that God does not know and care about and want the best for. And so sometimes it can feel really obsolete and pointless to be learning about all of these minute details of how our bodies work and how exactly we're producing the sounds that we're producing with our instruments. And ultimately, it has been really helpful for me to remember and to remind myself that God knows all of these muscles and he can like X-ray vision, like see them where I can't. And
Yeah.
inviting God into that process of learning not only like the names and functions of all of these muscles, but also inviting him into my own process of learning how to use them in the way that they were created to be used in the most free way possible. And I remember like one of my voice professors in college would talk about how the most free voices he's ever heard in his life were babies' first cry when they came out of the womb. And
Oh
he was
wow.
like, they are uninhibited and they know, like, obviously not consciously, like, because they're newborns, right? But they are so free in the way that they are able to use their lungs and their vocal cords and their mouths and all the muscles in their jaws and their tongues. He was like, we're essentially unlearning everything that we have even unconsciously learned throughout our lives that caused us to go from this completely uninhibited newborn that knew, you know, if you've ever heard a newborn baby scream, they are loud. And
Oh yeah.
he, you know, he talks to us as like a classroom full of opera singers, and he's like, you guys are studying to try and learn how to use your voices to project over an orchestra. If I put a newborn baby on that stage, they are going to do better than you. They are going to project over that 36-piece orchestra. Like, they just know how to do it naturally. It's so naturally occurring. But then as we observe like observe our parents and our siblings and the people around us as we're growing up, and we learn how to pronounce things in whatever language we grow up speaking, and we learn all of these subconscious habits and patterns of how to use our voices. And it actually ends up damaging that initial goodness that we had and that initial freedom in being able to use our voices and our muscles just completely freely. And so really what we're studying is how to unlearn all of that and like go back to our newborn state of like vocal use. And that always really struck me because like we are created with this innate desire and understanding for freedom in our bodies. And it's only as we grow up and develop these habits that becomes unlearned somehow. And I just think
That
that's
is
really profound
fascinating.
and beautiful.
Yeah, that's absolutely, absolutely fascinating. And it's like when we look at the sources of tension, it's in the body, it's generally negative, you know. There are some, I guess, quote unquote good tension, but that's like the good tension really is when your muscles are existing in the way that they're meant to exist,
Yes.
you know. Versus, you know, bad tension, which is like what we normally think of with tension.
Yeah.
And like the sources of bad tension are all really things that we only have to deal with because original sin came into the world. Or like even like something like language, which obviously, you know, the spoken word and the written word are good things, you know, like Jesus is the word, like he's known as the word in the Bible, right? The word became flesh. But the different having all these different languages is a byproduct of original sin as well. You know, we see it like with the story of the Tower of Babel in the Bible, you know, like everyone spoke the same language up until that point, and now we have a division of languages. So it's like, you know, all of these things like kind of go back to original sin really at the end of the day.
Yeah, it's very interesting to kind of observe how all of that works. And to seek out and try to find this freedom. I think it's really unique for musicians. I think a lot of other professions like don't even consider this sort of implication on their work. And I think we're really blessed that we get to you know, in our professional development actually learn something about who we are as people and who we were created to be by God. I think it's really beautiful and unique that that gets to be our experience.
Oh, absolutely. I wholeheartedly agree. I remember, I think it was back when we took that wellness for musicians class, Tara, in college. I remember reading a statistic on office workers and carpal tunnel. And the rates of carpal tunnel in like your standard, you know, people working in an office 9 to 5 have gone up significantly since technology, like the technology of like computers and stuff has entered the workforce. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that your typical keyboard is not very friendly for the way that our hands were designed to work, you know?
Yeah.
And that's why we have things like ergonomic keyboards and stuff. But, you know, I have a friend who has issues with her hands with carpal tunnel and tendonitis from office work, and was like, I don't even know where to start with this, you know, like it's just not something that's really addressed at all. Whereas at least, you know, over with the field of music, like, you know, there's a growing awareness. It's not where it should be yet. But it's certainly better than, you know, what previous generations of musicians had to deal with.
Yeah.
There is a growing awareness of how the human body works and of that being a very important thing to understand in playing an instrument and cultivating healthy habits, and whether it's in the practice room, rehearsals, whatnot, for how to, you know, in I don't necessarily want to say combating, but maybe like, you know, well, combating, I suppose, if you have an injury already, but if you don't have an injury, you know, stopping a problem before it ever starts, you know,
like preventative care.
Yes, there we go. Preventative care. And praise be for that there's a growing awareness of that, of that need.
And I think as well, like what you were saying before about how when Theology of the Body was first discussed at these Wednesday audiences by JP2, it was positively shocking for people to hear the Pope of all people publicly addressing human sexuality, which was very taboo at the time. And in the same way, there is definitely that same sort of attitude towards musicians' injuries. It's very taboo to address. You kind of want to keep it under wraps, keep it under the rug. And I agree with you that I think now, especially among our generation of musicians, there's a growing tendency to be a lot more open about your injuries and your experiences with trying to heal your body when things go wrong. And it's having very, very positive effects on the up and coming musicians, because we need to be addressing this. We need to be talking about it. It's so important to bring all these things to light so that we can learn from each other, learn from each other's experiences, and ultimately help each other to achieve that bodily freedom that we're all seeking.
Yes, and amen to that. Before we wrap up, just a couple other points that I wish we had time to devote more to, but we are starting to run out of time here. The first, going back to the idea of original solitude and original unity that John Paul II talks about, how we were made to be in communion with others. I think that we can link this a little bit to why it is not good to spend hours in a practice room by yourself, because we were not meant to do that as musicians, as people, even. We were not made to do that. And I think that there's this idea that, if you're going to be successful, you have to spend hours in a practice room. And that has been very detrimental to a lot of musicians' mental health.
Yeah.
And I think it really goes back to this idea of, that we were meant to be in community.
Yeah.
We were not meant to be, by ourselves for 8 hours a day in a practice room.
For sure. Like the longer you spend in solitude, first of all, the easier it is to beat yourself up about things.
Exactly.
Second of all, it can be really helpful for your own perspective to like invite some friends to practice with you, or like listen to progress that you're making on a particular piece and give their own feedback and their own thoughts, because probably a lot of the time they are going to hear a lot of positive qualities that you may be a little bit too harsh with yourself to be honest about.
Absolutely. Or even like when I was in the later part of my undergrad and in grad school, and I was dealing with injuries and all of that, and wasn't able to practice nearly as much as I would have wanted to. It was really shamefully low. Like, I don't even want to admit it, like publicly, how what my practicing time looked like during those periods of my life. But in learning to be more efficient with my practicing, which was a gift in of itself, there are things that you can practice when you're, say, rehearsing with like a chamber group or rehearsing in a small ensemble. There are things that you can be actively practicing that, you don't necessarily have to just be in a practice room working on your own repertoire. So that's also something to keep in mind as well. And then the last thing that, I wish we had more time to touch on is how this applies to teaching, how some of this applies to teaching.
Yeah.
And the main point I want to make here is respecting the dignity of the student in front of us as teachers. And sometimes we can even do this by mistake, say something thoughtlessly in a lesson that may actually be hurtful to a student, or whatnot. But there was a practice for a long time of, teachers being really harsh on their students. And that doesn't respect the dignity of the other at all. And thankfully, we're in an era, I think, where we've pretty much largely broken away from that as as musicians and as music teachers, which is really good that we're breaking away from that. But But on the flip side, as students, if we experienced that with a teacher who was really, really harsh, and have walked away with some really negative thought patterns or whatnot, like basically, just know that your dignity was not being respected, and that was wrong to happen.
Yeah.
And I would just really encourage you, if you've had these experiences, to take those to prayer, to bring them to the Lord, because, as we've been talking about lately, like, God is the divine physician and he wants to heal you.
Yeah.
So yeah, just wanted to put that out there.
I love
but
that.
I think there's a lot more that could be said on with pedagogy and all of that actually really tie into some of our discussions with moving freely and all of that sort of stuff.
Yeah, that's so important.
Well, on that note, I think we should end there.
Yes.
But Tara, what have you been listening to lately?
Okay, this is a simple, kind of funny answer, but actually, the Muppets theme song.
Amazing. I love that.
Because I discovered one of my colleagues is from India, and I discovered that the Muppets is not a thing there. He's like completely unaware of the Muppets. And this was shocking to me because, like, having become friends with him, it's like totally right up his alley. It's completely his sense of humor. And so I made it my mission last week to like basically spam him with Muppets content. And I started obviously with the Muppets theme song. And as I sent it to him, it got stuck in my own head. It's such an earworm. And I was like, this is actually a bop. And it like really lightened my mood. And I
love that.
I had like, it's a very busy time for me right now, like with work. There's a lot going on, lots of projects, lots to get done. It's a little bit stressful. And I was just bopping around the office singing the Muppets theme song. And in the midst of all of the craziness and the stress and stuff, I was like, this is really enjoyable. I'm glad that of all the music out there in the world, that like this is what's stuck in my head. So
I love that. That's so fun.
Yeah, it was really fun. What about you, Cecilia? What have you been listening to?
So the other weekend, my husband and I went to hear the Naples Philharmonic, and they did Rachmaninoff's Third Piano Concerto, which was really good. I'd never heard it before. Well, actually, I realized when it started playing, I have heard a little bit of the first movement before.
Yeah.
But I really haven't, like, I've never listened to it all the way before until the other weekend. And really, really great concerto, but it inspired me to go back and listen to some Rachmaninoff, and I just love his second piano concerto so much, especially the last movement. I know like the second movement is the one that gets all the hype because it's so beautiful and romantic and it's used in movies and all of that sort of stuff.
Yeah.
But the third movement, oh my gosh, it's so good.
Oh,
I absolutely love it. It's so much fun to listen to. It also brings back memories of my grandpa. My grandpa, I did not realize until like probably the last year of his life when I was living with him and my grandma during grad school, was a piano prodigy. And I mean, I knew that he played piano. I knew that he was good at it. He played until he was 14, at which point his parents were pretty poor and they had fallen behind on payments on their piano. So unfortunately the piano was taken, and he had to stop lessons then. But his teacher wanted him to go to Juilliard, and I sort of knew that, and I like prior to this, and was like, oh, he must have been pretty good if the teacher wanted him to go to Juilliard. But I remember he sat down at the piano one day and told me that like the last piece that because I think we were talking about something to do with like piano music, and Rachmaninoff came up, and he was like, oh yeah, the last piece that I ever played was Rachmaninoff's Second Piano Concerto. And I was like, what? Like, as a 14-year-old, you were playing that? Like, what? This can't be right. And then he proceeded to, like, sit there at the piano with his, like, very gnarly, like, old hands. Where, like, he was, like, super sick with cancer. Just an absolute mess. And proceeded to play for me some of the end of the third movement of Rachmaninoff's Second Piano Concerto, like really well. And I'm like, what is going on here?
Oh my gosh.
Right? So that was when I found out my grandpa had actually been a piano prodigy. So listening to the third movement for me it's not just fun, like it also just brings back really good memories of my grandpa as well.
That's
so
such a sweet memory.
That's what I've been listening to.
That's so beautiful and such a sweet memory to share. Wow.
Yeah. Good times.
Yeah, very good.
Well, with that being said, we're going to end it here. Thank you guys so much for tuning in, and we will see you next week. God bless.
God bless. Thanks for tuning in to this episode of the Little Sparks podcast. For more information on this podcast and our ministry, please visit www.thehildegardcollective.com.